I just finished a ride, and when I pulled the bike off of the rack, I noticed something that I've been meaning to talk about for a while because it's a question that I get a lot. And that is the suspension travel O-rings that are on the fork and the shock of your mountain bike. It's something that a lot of people use, but from what I can tell, many people aren't using them to the fullest extent. And so I thought I'd do a video that is probably longer than most people would even expect is possible on these because there's a lot to talk about. But really explaining what you might do to use these rings to your advantage and understand how your suspension is working. So the primary thing that people would use these O-rings for is to set sag on your suspension. And that's done obviously at the beginning of a ride or when you first set your bike up. And you would use these rings to put them all the way down at the bottom of the fork and up at the seal of the shock, and then stand on the bike, check the sag, measure that, and then compare that to the overall travel. But that's not all they're used for. And so coming out of the ride today, observing where these O-rings ended up, is a good time to talk about what else you would do with these. So you can see that on my fork, I used, not sure, haven't measured it exactly, but let's call that 95, maybe somewhere a little less than that percent of the travel. And on the shock, I'll call that 100% of travel. And I know that because that's about where these O-rings would stop. It's something that I do periodically on a ride, especially when I'm setting a bike up. And it's also something that you need to do more than once during your ride. That's probably the biggest thing that I would talk about first, is that a lot of people will reset these O-rings and they'll get started with a ride, they'll put the O-ring down here, and then at the end of the ride, they'll observe where it made it to. Sometimes it's here, sometimes it's all the way up at the top, and they'll kind of make an assessment of how the suspension is working based on that. But the biggest difference that I do, that I don't see a lot of people doing, is I reset these rings a handful of times throughout the ride. So if I go out on a 2-hour ride and I'm really trying to dial a bike in, even sometimes when I'm just dealing with pressure changes or small setup changes, I'll reset these rings at least 5 or 6 times throughout the ride and take an assessment of what's happening to them, because most trails are not that consistent. So there's different sections of trail that are rockier or more gravity oriented, and you're going to use more travel. There's other sections that are a little more mellow. So I want to get a good example and kind of run multiple tests throughout the span of a ride to see where these rings end up. The other thing I'll do is make sure that I'm resetting these rings both in the very beginning and towards the end of the ride to see what the difference is in my fatigue level. Something that a lot of people don't necessarily think about is that the longer you ride, the more fatigued you get, the stiffer your suspension will feel. And it's not necessarily because the suspension is fading or the dampers are doing anything funny. A lot of it is just because the energy you can put back into the bike is less than what it was when you started. And so everything starts to feel a little harsher. Oftentimes what you'll find is if this ring is up here at that 90% travel range in the beginning of the ride, and you reset it towards the end, then you're going to be using a little bit less travel overall because your fatigue level doesn't allow you to really push into the bike as hard. Let's back all the way up and talk about how you even know where these rings would stop, because it's opposite on the fork and on the shock. On the fork, no matter what your travel is set to on the fork, I guess I'll call it the upper limit is here at the very top of the fork, because the travel adjustment is made on the air side at the bottom of the air spring. So the end of your travel on your fork is always going to be up at the limit of whatever that chassis is. On the shock, it's a little bit different, because if you have a shock of a certain size, sometimes it'll be spaced down so that you don't actually use the full potential travel of the shock. This frame is an example. This is a 190 by 45 shock. And this is about where the O-ring ends up when you compress this completely. But if this frame was using, let's say, a 190 by 40 shock instead of 45, what that would mean is there would be a 5mm spacer on the top side of the seal head inside this shock, and that would be your travel limit. But what that means is that this air can and this wiper seal just stops a little short of where it otherwise could. So don't necessarily make the assumption that your O-ring has to be right here at the very end to be 100% travel. Depending on your bike and the shock setup, it could be even here. So the best thing to do to find out where your true extreme is on total travel is to let all of the air out of the shock and the fork, compress the bike all the way and then just see where the O-rings go. From there, I would always recommend just take a Sharpie and make a tiny little dot on the shock area here on the body and also on the fork. It's not going to matter. It won't affect the performance or anything. It won't do anything to the seals. But that dot will be a good reference for you to know exactly where your fork ends. The other thing you can do is when you're checking sag, you can make another dot. And if you want to put it on the inside so it's not visible, that's fine too. But that dot can be kind of what you're looking for. When it comes to checking sag, the question will always come up, how much should there be? And the first thing I'll say about it is don't necessarily use sag as the end-all be-all for setup. It's something that I recommend to people who are beginners at setting suspension up, but it's something that I don't really use all that much, and I don't recommend to people who are a little more seasoned about it, because it's really much more important to set spring rate or effective spring rate if it's air suspension more than the sag level. I'll probably do another video on that, but the biggest thing I would say about it is sag can easily be exactly in the right place and you can still be very unhappy with your suspension because everything else is off. So it's not something that you can guarantee is going to be a predictor that the suspension is going to be working well. Generally speaking, you'll want that sag number to be between 25 and 30% of total travel. So after you figure out how much travel you've got here, you might know it because you might know you just have a 120 millimeter fork or something like that. After you figure out how much travel you have, then when you do a sag test, your O-ring will end up somewhere like this. And what you'll do is you'll measure this distance between the top of the wiper seal and the bottom of the O-ring, and however many millimeters are there, you'll divide that by the total travel, and that'll be your sag percentage. Critically though, if you measure this is a 130 fork is where it's set right now. And if you measure this won't actually measure 130. It'll measure something closer to 120, 122, 125. And the reason being, because I have this fork fully pressurized, and so there's pressure in the lower air chamber as well as the upper air chamber. What that's doing is forcing the fork to compress slightly. That's natural, but what that means is that you're actually accounting for some of the travel that you can't see visibly. So if you measure this, if you don't know what your fork travel is, if you measure this and you get some number that's not normal, it's not 120, 130, 140, 160, whatever you would think the fork would be, and it's some number in between, then just know that's probably because the suspension is collapsing slightly under its own air pressure equalization. That's fine. That's totally normal. Now, back to using what your measurements are. Once you have your sag set and it's something that you're using as a reference point, you can start to ride the bike, test it, figure out what's working for you. Another one of the questions that I get is, how much travel should I be using? And should I be bottoming out my suspension? I get that particularly from people who are new to this and are trying to set their first mountain bike up or their mountain bike up that they just got. And it's representative of the most common condition that I see. I help people with this every week, so I see all kinds of different setups and all kinds of different preferences. The most common thing to see is that people will complain their suspension isn't working all that well, and you'll do some tests with them, watch them ride, hang out with them a little bit, and you'll see that they're using about that much of their suspension. And they'll be chasing it with volume tokens or tire pressure or wanting to get different suspension components altogether, and a lot of the times it'll just be because the bike is just set up too stiff, plain and simple. I personally think it's a psychological effect. It's a little bit like an insurance policy in your brain. People imagine that a stiffer setup is better because more is always better. And well, there's a little bit of truth to that, because I would always recommend a stiffer setup. Let me take that back. I would always recommend a setup that's slightly too stiff over a setup that's too soft, but that's only for safety. Because if you have a setup that's too soft, you're going to be blowing through the travel and bottoming out all the time. If it's too stiff, then there's at least going to be the safety factor of support that's there for the bike. But I think generally people take that too far a lot of times. And what's kind of interesting is that you'll end up seeing people riding bikes that are probably a little too big for their local trails. So this bike happens to be 100 millimeter rear travel, but if you saw a common setup, you might see that O-ring stopping somewhere about like that. And this bike would end up using a total of what amounts to maybe 70 or 80 millimeters of rear wheel travel. When you extrapolate that to a bigger trail bike, you'll see people riding 150, 160 mil rear travel bikes and using only about that percentage of the travel. And then if you really look into it deep, you realize they're not using any more travel than they would be if they had a light trail bike in the 120, 130 mil range and just had it set up appropriately to use all the travel. My number one example or recommendation for making sure that you're in the right place is that you don't really want to feel a super harsh bottom out on any setup. You'll know when you feel it. The shock, the fork, it doesn't really matter. If you bottom out completely, something like putting that O-ring all the way up here at the top, you'll actually feel metal on metal. It'll be metallic, it'll be ugly, it'll make noise. It's not good, it'll be very harsh. You'll know when you did it. I don't think you should ever aim to experience that. Some of the time you'll see recommendations online where people say, well, you should always hard bottom out once a ride. That means you're using the most amount of travel, because if you can do it once a ride only, then you're somehow like in the right spread of where your travel should be. It's one approach, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. And that's probably the main reason I would say the best thing to do is to just reset this O-ring a lot while you ride and come up with the best average. So if you reset this, if you're out for a couple hour ride, reset this 6 or 8 times, and most of the trail, most of the conditions, if you're using that 90, 95% travel range, then that's pretty good. And it leaves you a little bit of insurance policy for if you really mess up and pick a bad line and the bike takes a huge beating. You kind of want that there in a lot of cases. If you are a really, really good rider and you barely make mistakes and it's not something that you experience very often, or if you stick to the ground more, you don't do any gravity stuff, you're not hitting big jumps where there's the opportunity to be surprised by a really harsh landing, then maybe what you do is you search for using more of that travel range. Whereas somebody who's doing more downhill trails or somebody who's riding like an enduro bike, they might want a little more buffer. So their average riding is consuming 80, 85% of the travel, because they know occasionally they're going to get caught off guard, they're going to have a really big hit, and they're going to want that little extra bit there as a cushion. So those are some things to think about when it comes to using the travel adjust rings. And it's not something that is a one and done pursuit. I would always recommend that, lastly, before I close this out, this becomes part of your normal cadence. Just like tire pressure, just like other suspension setup, just like other tweaks on the bike, make sure this is something you're always paying attention to, because it can tell you other things about your suspension as well. If you start to see these travel rings migrate to a place where you're only using way less of the travel than you normally would, then it might be indicative of another condition. You can maybe have too much air trapped in the lowers of a fork, let's say. And when that's the case, you'll start to see that your pressure setup will migrate up over time in order to keep this ring in the range that you're used to. Well, if you're making notes and you start to see that your pressure is climbing for the same setup, you might be able to identify that there's something wrong with your fork, which would be excess pressure in the lowers, let's say. Or even some service things, like when these seals get too worn out and there's a little bit too much stiction, or you start to lose all of the lubrication in the lowers and the fork isn't working with the same fluidity that it was before, those can all be indicators that something needs serviced, or the damper needs bled or rebuilt or something like that. And a lot of that will show up first if you're paying attention to where these rings are, and it's something that you're doing on either every ride or every few rides just to kind of keep tabs on it. Hopefully that is helpful, and it's almost hard to believe I've gone 14 minutes already on travel rings, because most people think that this is just a very simple thing, and it's, set it once and you're done. But really pay attention to those, because they can tell you a lot about what the suspension is doing and give you a better line of sight to how your setup is working and how it could be working in the future. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. I'd be happy to answer them, and we'll see you next time.